Their shelters are now going to become ovens. Their havens will be turned into ovens, because once these fire bombs hit and ignite this kindling, this wood, it will create such a vast hellstorm. That's where the title from this book comes from, Hellstorm. 1,500 to 3,000 degrees, people are estimating. It creates a vortex, a literal tornado, the updraft of fire. A tornado of fire. Some estimates, I wasn't there, but these are some of the estimates. Some people said the thing went 3 miles high. Some people tell me that that's impossible. It can't be happened. I wasn't there. Maybe it couldn't happen. I'm just telling you what the people said. It must have went 3 miles into the sky. This enormous rush of cold air from the outer parts of Hamburg, rushing towards the center of the city where the fire is at and where it's most intense, creating this hurricane force of tornadic wind that literally rips roofs from their buildings, that sucks trolley cars into the center. And people who are still running, trying to escape their ovens, their shelters, they too are sucked into this vortex of flame. Those who weren't sucked in were actually stuck in the asphalt, and then they burst into flames, of course. Now, that is what a raid from 1943 on is all about, a terror bombing raid, a firestorm, basically to kill as many men, women, and children as possible. And of course, they did their job. What they did, they knew what they were doing. They calculated this very methodically, very demonically. They first would blow a town to bits. In this case, it was Hamburg. In the next case, it would be a smaller city, say Dusseldorf or someplace like that, blow it to bits. And then they would come back an hour or so later, catching the rescue workers and catching the fire crews and catching the survivors from the previous raid out in the open. That's exactly what they wanted to do, because they could kill them much quicker. They could catch them in these storms. And if that isn't a war crime, well, of course it is a war crime. I'm not going to be rhetorical about this. It's one of the greater war crimes in world history. Right off the top, we're talking about a war that's filled with war crimes. And I'm not talking about so-called Nazi war crimes either. I'm talking about Allied war crimes. This procedure, this firestorm raids, continued all the way to the end of the war, and that brings up Dresden. That brings up Stalin's demand for a major action somewhere to draw Germans away. Keep in mind, after Hamburg, the same process, the same procedure of blasting a city to rubble and then firebombing it later continued. On and on. Every German city above, say, 25,000 suffered the same fate. This wasn't an aberration. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an anomaly. This occurred through precision, through thought of forethought. But anyway, by the time it rolls around February 13th, 1945, which happens to be the German Mardi Gras, Fasching, they call it, the German Mardi Gras. Dresden is a city in the eastern part of Germany, had not been touched throughout the war, a couple of small, insignificant raids that occurred. Dresden was one of the most beautiful cities on earth. People compared it to Florence in Italy. They called it the Florence on the Elbe River. Americans and British, that was one of their favorite tourist destinations because it was one of the most incredibly beautiful, artistic, medieval city you will ever see. It was something right out of Disney. It was so beautiful. When I look at the pre-1945 photographs, only devils, only demons could wish the destruction of this city. It's that absolutely gorgeous and unbelievable. But anyway, Dresden had not been touched. And again, there was lots of speculation about why the population, the roughly 500,000, why we have been spared when everybody else has been destroyed. And they ran the gamut, of course. Some thought it was the 25,000 Americans that were prisoners there. Some thought it was because Dresden had become a hospital city, not just for military people, but for all people, for cancer victims. It was a place they could go and find refuge and be healed, hopefully. Or some people thought it was because Dresden was so beautiful that even the Allied terror bombers didn't have a heart to destroy a city so beautiful as this. Or more than likely, by February of 1945, most people assume that the reason it hadn't been bombed is because Dresden had become a refugee city. Thousands, hundreds of thousands. In fact, on the night of February 13th, it's estimated at 600,000 people fleeing the Red Army advance in the east had found haven, temporary haven, in Dresden. In other words, we have a city now with a normal population of 500,000 suddenly crammed with twice that number. You've got over 1 million people packed in the center of Dresden. So what a perfect place to raid, of course. Stalin wanted it. Churchill was happy to deliver. So were the Americans, by the way, just happy as clams. And that night, February 13th, of course, the same procedure I described in Hamburg, the initial storming into the city with 1,000 planes, blowing it to atoms, utterly destroying it. It's nothing but a smoking ruin of bricks and dust and splinters after that initial raid. And people, of course, when they came out, you know, there's things worse than death, Clay, and this must be one of them, because a city that you've grown up in, loved, went to school in, played on its streets, and then learned to love its architecture and its beauty and its tradition and history and culture, to come out and see it's all gone. It's all been blasted to atoms. You know, that's what I mean. They must have been so devastated that some people just said, well, "Oh hell, I'm going to die. I want to die now."
Let me stop you and ask you about that. Yeah. This is in my mind. Today, Germany is almost under the control of the Jews. They have kind of submitted to the whole New World Order thing, it looks like to me, from a distance here. Why aren't they pulling together? Why isn't every German outraged here? If they had, if the Russians had come over here and bombed Dallas or Washington or L.A. for that matter, wouldn't we be enraged about this? Why would we let it go like the Germans have? Is their brainwashing that intense? The guilt trip that was laid on them?
It is. Yes, I've got to say that I've talked to too many Germans. I think I know what I'm talking about. Yep, it was very, very thorough, very efficient, and not complete, of course. I know plenty of people who just didn't swallow it. But, yeah, you've got 100% Germans over there hating themselves, hating their parents, hating their grandparents. You've got some of the most ugly and vicious and damnable Marxists that are pure Germans. Not Jews, not Americans, Germans. And they're some of the most vicious people I've ever met in my life.
In your book here, you've got one paragraph that I can't I can't stop reading it. A German woman has her jaws forced open by the filthy, brutish hands of a Soviet serial rapist. He literally spits into her mouth and forces her to swallow his filth as he rams her body again and again. And he's satisfied, fulfilling his oath to Stalin and his chief Holocaust propagandist, Ilya Ehrenberg. And I'll skip over the next one. Her pamphlet, distributed to the millions among Red Army troops on the front lines of battle who were already intoxicated with hate and vengefulness as a result of over 2 decades of Bolshevik oppression, mass murder in their families, and mass civilization, urged Soviet troops to rape, plunder, and kill. The Germans are not human beings. From now on, the word German is the most horrible curse. From now on, the word German strikes us to the quick. We have nothing to discuss. We will not get excited. We will kill. If you have not killed at least one German a day, you've wasted the day. If you cannot kill a German with a bullet, then kill them with your bayonet. If your part of the front is quiet and there is no fighting, then kill a German in the meantime. If you already killed a German, then kill another one. There's nothing more amusing to us than a heap of German corpses. Don't waste the day. Don't count the kilometers. Count only one thing, the number of Germans you have killed. Kill the Germans, kill the Germans, kill. And, you know, this really affects me because my family is German. I consider myself a German, you know, Texas German, but it's you know, I can't just sit by and ignore this any more than I could sit by and ignore the murder of 17 little children and their families at Waco.
You know, let me say this also. You read some passages that were reviews, not my actual writing. In fact, the book itself is what's called a first-person you are there approach. In other words, I allow the people themselves to describe what they're going through, whether it's the bombing rate, as we're talking about now, or whether it's the massive rapes. Yes, we'll get to that in just a little bit.
Okay.
The millions of German women that were raped millions of times. It's what it was like to go through that. I try to keep myself out of this as much as possible. Like I said, I'm basically setting the table. I try to hold it together with the best I can, but you're absolutely right. Ilya Ehrenberg, this Jewish propagandist for Stalin, he absolutely encouraged. I let Ilya Ehrenberg do his talking too. He absolutely encouraged the mass rape, the mass murder of German women. He said, when you're through with them, kill them. When you're through playing with them, treat them like toys, and then kill them. And that's what he said. And he tried to deny that after the war, but his words are there. Trust me, they're there in the thousands. Not just once or twice, but hundreds of times he said this. And he made sure that while many other propagandists are trying to reach the top echelons of power, Ilya Ehrenberg, being the very shrewd propagandist that he was, he aimed for the man in the front lines, the Russian soldier. And by the way, I'm going to say this right now. We may not get to it in time, but Russians have rightly so been described as massive rapists, and they were. But let me say, the frontline Russian soldier, like frontline Russian soldiers everywhere, was generally the White Russian, the Ukrainian, the Belarus, people who fought these hard-fighting shock troops. And it's like any other army I've ever researched. The frontline soldiers have way too much on their mind to be screwing around with stupid stuff like stealing watches, or like getting terribly drunk, or like raping somebody. They're more worried about a black hole being bored right through their forehead by a sniper up ahead, or kicking open his door and some German soldier machine gunning them dead. Whereas the second line of troops, the rear echelon, the supply side coming up, they had ample time to screw around and do terrible things. And in the case of the Soviet army, these were, by and large, they were Asiatics. They were especially the Mongolians. But time and time and time again, the victims, that is the German women, and occasionally the German men too, who were raped. They talk about the Asiatics, the slit eyes, doing the damage. These were the rear echelon, who drank everything from perfume to fine cognac when they got their hands on it, who raped every woman from age 8 to 80. That was the going rate of exchange. Actually, I've got accounts of them raping kids from the age of 6 all the way up to 90s. They would even rape corpses. And it's not an anomaly. I'm not exaggerating. This isn't hyperbole. In fact, it happens so many times that it's a policy. And I'm not joking about that. I'm not going to make excuses for these characters. Oh, well, they were drunk and they didn't know what they're doing. No, time and time again, on a street, in the middle of the day, in a crowd, they're laughing as they stand in line to rape a corpse, a woman who has died from being over-raped. Or they'll raid nursing homes, or they'll raid even morgues and rape the victims on the slabs. I know how ghoulish, how hideous this sounds. Have you ever heard of this before, Clay? Had you ever seen?
No, not to that extent. No, I had not.
It's beyond hell. It's beyond, I've never even thought of some of these things that happen. And I'm not even, as you probably know, if you've read the entire book, there are things in here that I'm not even going to mention here on the air. There are
I
things
have,
so
but I
friggin-
have not, but I would like to. If you've got it on a PDF, I don't. I really am not in a position. I can't even get to a bookstore. So.
Well, let me say this. I won't say what's there because it is scripted. It's scripted in hell. The script could have been written in hell. The things that they did to the German women. And I'm going to even go right now further while we're on the subject. The Americans, they've been given a free pass, more or less, on the raping and the slaughter and the stealing and the destruction. Americans were doing just about as bad as the Russians were. Americans had a better propaganda mill working for them over there. They had people covering for them. They had lots of Jewish writers who went along and poo-pooed the idea that Americans might be raping. Too many German women testify that the Americans were doing virtually the same things as the Russians. To my knowledge, however, the only difference between the Soviet soldiers and the American soldiers was that the Americans didn't necessarily kill the women when they were through with them, as the Soviet soldiers did. And incidentally, well, anyway, I know I'm skipping around here.
That's all right.
Dresden is has become a symbol. And I think if the German nation ever stands up on its feet again and kicks the Americans out and kicks the Jewish overseers out of Germany and writes its own ship and straightens the people out, the ones that have been thoroughly brainwashed, then Dresden will probably be the symbol that stands out the most. In fact, there's all sorts of signs pointing it's already become the symbol. Every year there's a rally in Dresden that grows and grows. Basically to acknowledge one of the greatest atrocities in history, and that's Dresden. Now, I'm living proof, my book is, that Dresden, terrible as it was, still doesn't stand head and shoulders above the other atrocities that occurred. I could go on about that, but Dresden was firebombed and destroyed, and people died in their thousands, in their tens of thousands, and in their hundreds of thousands by the same process I mentioned in Hamburg. They were crammed in there. There was no place to go. They were stuck in the asphalt. The fires were so hot in Dresden that they melted their copper roofs, the old copper medieval roofs, and as if it wasn't bad enough, now the people have molten metal pouring down on them, killing them. The next day, after the fires started to cool, after Dresden was utterly destroyed, after the bodies were laying around, had shrunk to the size of dogs and cats because of the terrible heat, the very next day, as people were trying to get a little relief from this massacre at the parks along the Elbe River, guess what? The Americans roll in with their P-47 fighter planes, and are strafing the people. They can see, it's a clear day. They can see they're diving down to around 500 feet to strafe the people, the refugees, the women, the children. And that's almost all there is in Dresden at this late stage of the war. They're slaughtering the people. They're shooting them with machine gun and cannon fire. They're opening up holes big enough to put your fist through them. They're shooting people as they're running through the grass, along the river. By the thousands, they're killing them. They're even killing animals that escaped from the zoo. In fact, one zookeeper watched as an American pilot zoomed down, chased down, and shot to death his last remaining giraffe. That's what the war has become. That's the nature of the war at the end, toward the end. And by the way, Dresden today, there's a real concerted effort on the part of the Jewish media and the powers that be in Germany, who are nothing but dogs and puppets of the Jewish power grid throughout the world. There's an attempt to diminish the death count in Dresden. Some people say 25,000, some people say 35,000 died, and they say, yes, it's terrible, we know, but that's what happened. War is hell, and by the way, they got what they deserved. Well, I got to tell you what, right after, about 2 weeks after Dresden bombing, the Dresden massacre itself, the International Red Cross from Switzerland came in. And they found that at least 200,000 people died that night. A little while later, Berlin bean counters, functionaries, leaders came down to themselves try to get a feel for how many people died, and they thought as many as 250,000 to 400,000 died. Now, Germans then and now are some of the most thorough, efficient bean counters the world has ever seen. I mean, these people are religious in their keeping of data and details. And if they're going to say 250,000 to 400,000, am I going to believe somebody today who's telling me that 25 to 35,000 died who weren't even born then? I'm going with the people who were there on the ground. So we've got this massacre that does stand out, but every other German city, relatively speaking, suffered the same as Dresden. In fact, 2 weeks later, Pforzheim, a really smaller city, maybe 25,000, in western Germany, was firebombed. And within 15 minutes, I think it was 20,000 people were dead. Now, in relative terms, of course, that's even a greater disaster than Dresden. But, and then, by the way, while we're still on the air war, so-called air war, it's an air massacre by this stage of the war, 1944 to 1945. At the late stage of this air massacre, the Americans and the British were engaged in a policy called the targets of opportunity policy. And that was basically, you go out, night, day, whatever, and shoot anything that's moving in Germany. Whether it's a car, whether it's a truck, whether it's a bus, whether it's a train filled with refugees, whether it's a boat filled with refugees. They went out and they shot everything. I know because we have nose cone camera footage of what they're doing. They're shooting farmers in fields. They're shooting animals. They're shooting kids in playgrounds. They're shooting churches. They're shooting hospitals with a red cross prominently on the roof. They're shooting anything that moves. In the last few weeks of the war, nothing is moving in Germany. And so when the American armies are finally coming through, and the British, and they're finding these concentration camps with these starved, emaciated people, that's what they're finding. They're finding the damage they had wrought by killing everything that moved. No medicine, no food, nothing's getting through. If they had really cared at all, if they had not been into propaganda, if they'd been into truth, they would have seen that many of the German towns and villages themselves, people are also starving. You know, when they got to Dachau, when the Americans got to Dachau in the spring of '45, and they saw the bodies there. They saw the bodies in the railroad car, these emaciated corpses, just nothing but skin and bones. They went ballistic, they went berserk, because it seemed as if the propaganda they had heard for all these years about Nazi bestiality, about killing people in death camps, it seemed that it was true. And that day, roughly 500 SS men, old men and boys, had been brought into the camp to maintain order until the Americans arrived, because the original camp guards had fled. And anyway, they had maintained order. The Americans come in. Americans see all these bodies. They go ballistic. They've got these rats for officers who basically turn their men loose and say, kill all you can. And they turned the camp prisoners loose, too. Of these 500 Germans that were brought in to maintain order, German soldiers, not a one of them lived. 300 were put up against the wall and shot with machine gun fire. There are pictures of that. And there are videos, too. The rest were allowed to be slaughtered, tortured to death by these camp the prisoners. But anyway, back to the targets of opportunity. You know, the same thing is going to happen anywhere. If you do not allow communication, transportation, if you do not allow food and medicine to reach your cities, your towns, your farms, your concentration camps, people are going to die. That's what happens when you have no food, no medicine, no clothing. That's what's going to happen. You die from dysentery, you die from typhus, you die from smallpox, you die from every contagion there is there. And so that's at least what's happening in the east or the western part of Germany. But anyway, Clay, you got any questions? Because I could go on all day as I'm doing. I do have a question here. You know, I have made the comment on my show many times in the last 20 years that we fought on the wrong side. Again, as I said, my family came from Germany, the von Bears and the other people, the Wolves. And in my study of history,
these Zionists, or whatever you want to call them, Jews, Bolsheviks, they were the bad guys, and Germany tried to stand up. You know, I think Hitler tried to stand up to him. He may not have been the best. I mean, when you start fighting wars and you got to deal with bankers, and you know, somewhere up here the banksters, you know, fund both sides of every conflict there, and I don't know exactly where the line was drawn, but I also believe that what happened in Russia, how the Bolsheviks took over and really became the bad guys after murdering 15 million, 10 million, 20 million, 11 million in the Ukraine. They starved them to death in the Ukraine. That's like starving the population of Kansas the same way. I am afraid, and I talk about this all the time, I believe it's coming here. The way they've set things up, the way the banksters control everything. I'd like your opinion on that, and then you can go back and go anywhere you want.
Well, like I said, I'm not an expert, but I'll shoot from the hip, and I probably am as knowledgeable as most people out there. I feel like I'm living in a Marxist nation right now. This most recent excuse to steal the symbols of the South, the Confederate flag, this excuse, this church shooting, which was a terrible thing, of course. This guy goes in and blows them away, black people. But you can see how quickly it was used as a pretext, as an excuse to strip the various states of their symbols. This is how Marxism operates. Yes, it's a cultural form of Marxism. I grew up believing in this country. We're probably about the same age, Clayton. I'm a Vietnam vet, and we grew up, at least I did, and I'm sure you did too. I come from Kansas originally, Kansas and Missouri, not so far away from you. I grew up believing in this country. You know, I mean, I believed Walter Cronkite. I believed in the Republican Party. My parents were religious at voting that way. I liked Ike, just like my parents did. And so it's an easy step to make. You say, well, this country, I believe in what it's about. I believe it is a nation of freedom and honesty. And it's a terrible step off that cliff when you realize you were really all wrong about this. And it's not a deliberate or an intentional step off that cliff. It comes with knowledge. It comes with maturity. It comes with adulthood. It comes with education. And when you finally realize that, you know, this is I mean, it's robotics 101. We have been programmed to be this way. And I have become, very anti-government. And that's not going to get me too far in this world. I know that. I have been very critical. Right now, I have no doubt whatsoever these non-stop Middle East wars America fighting. They're fighting not for America or freedom or any other BS. They're fighting nothing but for Israel. This is all about Israel. These are Jewish instigated wars, and you know what a wonderful setup they have. Jewish wars, American body bags. You can't get better math than that. And that's exactly what's happening right now. This most recent attempt to stoke war with Russia.
You know, I think we are about the same age. I'm 68. I volunteered for Vietnam, and when I learned about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, I didn't want to fight anymore. I was offered a medical discharge or a pension or something like that. Oh, I could get on that next plane to Vietnam. I said, yeah, give me the pension, and I'll take that. I won't take the orders of... I won't take illegal orders anymore.
But you know, the Gulf of Tonkin, and I know exactly what you're talking about there, the pretext basically to step up the war against North Vietnam. something that didn't actually happen.
Right.
But America's been doing that ever since, at least since the Maine, and probably back to Fort Sumter, quite honestly. I don't know if the only good war America's ever fought wasn't the Revolution. That may have been it. After that, everything else is just it's a joke. It's a game. And the pretext, just for instance, Pearl Harbor, it's a given. It's a fact. Everybody knows this now. And I didn't invent it. I didn't even, unfortunately, I can't take credit for it. But everybody now knows that FDR and his Jewish advisors around him knew that the attack was coming somewhere in the Central Pacific. And I think that wouldn't be too hard to figure out, that it would be Hawaii. But they knew the Japanese. They had backed them into the corner with their sanctions. Sanctions are wars by other means, a war by other means. Basically, it's trying to kill somebody by depriving them of something. Japan was being deprived of its raw resources, and by some of American oil and processed goods. But that is a declaration of war. When the Americans sanctioned Japan, we have a very proud race of people, the Japanese, who have great aspirations. They see what the Americans and the British have done, and the French, in being colonizers. The Japanese want to do some of that themselves. And so they are a burgeoning nation that suddenly the Americans pull the rug out from under them and say, nope, you can't be that. We're taking away your ability to be that. You will not be getting any more iron or steel from America. We're going to take away the rubber plantations in Philippines, things like that. And that's exactly what they were doing, is backing Japan into a position that they had to strike out. They either had to give it up and admit that they're going to be a second-rate nation, or they had to go to war. And they went to war at Pearl Harbor. And of course, FDR and his advisors were elated because they had been trying to jockey the American people into the European war. And you know, by December 6th, 1941, 80-some% of Americans still didn't want any part of a European war. Let them handle it themselves. But after the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, that of course flipped, and 84% were now in favor of getting into a war. And the first thing, basically, a lot of people might have scratched their heads, but the initial war effort was not aimed at Japan, despite Pearl Harbor. Initially, the greatest thrust was toward Europe, and that's where the Jewish advisors and FDR wanted to go. Morgenthau, Bernard Baruch, and people like that around Roosevelt had wanted to get in to kill Hitler off. And so, with their dreams come true, they do. They send their forces in 1943 to Morocco and places, Iceland. My dad, my biological father, my adoptive dad, he was in the American Air Corps, the Army Air Corps, and we invaded places like Iceland and Greenland and Norway, and a lot of people don't realize that we basically did what we wanted. And while on this subject, and I am getting off a bit, but I'll touch upon this, still on the air war. You know, Switzerland's been neutral since Switzerland's been a country, and yet the Americans during World War II, 1944, 1945, pretty regularly bombed Switzerland. You've got a nation that's neutral. The Americans bombed Zurich, the Americans bombed Basel, and they bombed other cities. I was actually at a book fair once, a couple of years back, here in Florida, and I'm selling books on the street with other people, but up walked this tall man with an accent, and I asked, where are you from? And he said, I'm from Switzerland. And I said, oh, the book he was holding happened to be Hellstorm. I said, there's something you may or may not know about in this book, that the Americans bombed Switzerland. And he says, yes, I know. I was 5 years old at the time, and they destroyed my home. It was almost like somebody had walked out of the pages of that book and walked up to meet me. Bombing, have you ever heard about that, Clay?
No, I hadn't.
No, I mean, really, when you win wars, you not only write the history, you can make it up as you go along. Of course you haven't heard about it. Haven't heard about the targets of opportunity either. Slaughterfest, killing everything that moves. Everything that moves. Kids, animals, farmers, old people, women on bicycles trying to buy bread. Targets of opportunity. These are all war
I am
crimes.
still offended about Vietnam. I lost 58,000 of my brothers there that did go over there. For what? To kill farmers, to kill peasants, to kill women and children? I still don't see the purpose of that, what it did for us.
Korea is not much different, and these other wars, these Middle Eastern wars fought for Israel, are even worse. An argument could be made that, as we both know, back when we were young men, I actually believed in the domino theory, that if one nation fell to communism, this next weak nation was right behind. I think there is still some merit in that, but you cannot make any argument at all for these attacks throughout the Middle East that the Americans are making right now. This is all about making the world safer. God's chosen agitators, God's chosen assassins, God's chosen murderers in the Middle East, and that's the Israelis. I mean, we're proxy. We're America's pit bull. And I don't care how hard that may be for some people to swallow out there who might have children or fathers off right now in Afghanistan or Iraq or Sudan or what other crap hole Americans are right now. The fact is, we're fighting somebody else's war. We need to bring people home, and if nothing else, put them on the southern border to stop this invasion of America right now.
Well, this is exactly this is exactly their plan. Same thing's happening in Europe with Muslims, but those Mexicans are being sent here. Hell, they're putting them on planes and flying them in. This is an invading force. You know, I don't know whether Trump is good or bad. He's got Jewish connections, but at least he's talking about the right thing. We need to stop this invasion.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I've read a lot of criticism about Trump, and I'm assuming that's accurate. Nevertheless, we're in such a corner right now that when somebody pops up running for president and says a couple of things we like, we better listen to it. We better think about it and perhaps even vote for it. I understand. He said some things. He seems to be a very strong supporter of Israel. That's the last thing on earth we need, is somebody to be an even stronger supporter of Israel. We already give them our tax dollars. We give them our congressmen and women. We give them our body.
$10 million a day our government gives to Israel.
I've heard, and this was 20 or so years ago, that for every man, woman, and child in Israel, we're giving $7,000 in welfare. Now that was about 20 years ago, so it's no doubt up to at least 10,000. But let's put it this way: at this point, we've reached such a crisis. The white Americans have reached such a crisis that we probably cannot afford anymore to have somebody who's religiously saying what we want or religiously on our side. If they say one or two things, we better be thinking about that. Let's face it, the cardboard cutouts that surround Trump right now, the Bushes and the Christies, you know, I've seen actually more honest and intelligent faces on the back of trash trucks than I see in Bush and Christie and some of these other political creatures. Well, they weren't saying squat. They were saying nothing I wanted to hear. They expected us to just come right out and vote for them, I suppose, just because they're Republican.
I've done a book back in 25, 30 years ago. I got a hold of a top secret document from the National Security Agency that from Colonel Edward P. Catolo, and I got communication with somebody named in the document that was doing life in Walpole Prison. His name was William Tyree. I had him on my show. I had an 800 number back then. I had him on my show, and I put that in one chapter of my book, Mystery Babylon, The New World Order Unveiled, that outlined Bush's drug smuggling into this country. Mossad and CIA were used to bring the cocaine, and obviously they brought the heroin in from Vietnam too. And what do we got today? We sent our troops into Afghanistan to guard the opium poppy crops that those nasty old Taliban were destroying. I mean, and my book doesn't sell that well, by the way. And they've tried to kill me 3 times in the last 10 years.
Yeah. I can't even comment because I'm not very knowledgeable on that. I write books, but I'm a very slow reader, and I'm not as up on certain things as you are.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I don't doubt anything you're saying. Don't get me wrong on that. It's just that I can't comment because I just, it's like if you talk about nuclear physics, I couldn't say a thing about that.
Okay.
It's just, I'm just out of it. But as far, if you want to, why are we talking about this when I wrote a book on World War II? Because the dots are traceable all the way back to World War II. The current crap that we're living through, the corruption, the criminality, is traceable all the way from our loss. We lost that war, folks. The white world lost World War II. I can't make it any simpler than that. We lost. It was a Jewish victory. And we're living proof right now today. That's the reason we're living in such misery, such turmoil. I've got to say, there does seem to be, with the onset of the internet and cyberspace, there does seem to be a turnaround in this train wreck. We have been, for the last 100 years, let's face it, we have been as controlled and manipulated as any animal on any farm could ever be. And it's because the hands of the media were in the hands of Jews, hands of the few. They could say exactly what they wanted. They could get us into one war or keep us out of another if they wanted to. And it was really easy back in the old days of, the dead tree media. But now it's not so easy with cyberspace. We've got websites like yours everywhere, hundreds of them, maybe thousands of them.
We have a chance. That's all we've got, a chance.
We do, but the chance is there if we're willing to make that single finger tap on that computer to find out. All the wisdom of man is one single finger tap away. If people will not make that finger tap, if they're too frightened, then they're not worthy of life. They're not worthy of living. I encourage everybody who's listening right now, study, read, learn, and grow. Right now, let's put it this way. There is absolutely no chance that the evil corruption in Washington will ever improve. It is not going to improve. That's not the way crime syndicates work. The rot is just too deep and too far advanced. It's a rule mentality on the Potomac, and we can only expect more surveillance, not less, and we can expect less freedom, not more. And that said, I think secession is the only option, quite honestly. Secession. I think that can be achieved, and let's just do it. Let's just leave this sinister government that's continually anti-white in just virtually every action it makes, and pro-Israel. Let's say goodbye and good riddance to this gun-grabbing, this illegal alien-loving, this warmongering, this baby-killing, this freedom-stealing monstrosity, and leave it sitting there, just sitting and stinking like a steaming dog pile, all dressed up with nowhere to go. Let me clue you this. If the whites just simply walk away from it, who's going to keep the lights on?
Well, I agree with that 100%. And I came up with an answer quite a few years ago. I called it Liberty Village. I asked myself, how did we make it 50 years ago? How did we make it 100 years ago? And I suggested you just walk away from it and go back to the foundation of every civilization, which is the self-sufficient family farm. It's if you grow your own food and generate your own power from your roof or the wind or whatever, you don't need the government, you don't need the Jews, you don't need the banks for nothing.
Well said. I don't know how you convince enough people to do that, form these, right now, of course, and I know, there's movements to form these all-white enclaves. And I don't know what to say. I wish them the best of luck. I still need to stay out here, so to speak. But anyway, and some people think that violence is the answer, and I think sometimes violence is an answer, but this is not it. This rogue regime we're a part of right now, the United States of surveillance and torture, it wouldn't hesitate. We might say solution. We're gonna just withdraw, start paying taxes, and don't come over that line. And I'll guarantee you that's one way to have it all end real quickly, because this same country, they wouldn't hesitate to mow us down. Some people are under the naive illusion that these American soldiers are American through and through, and no way in holy heck would they fire upon us. I'll guarantee you they'd fire on us and kill us and mow us down as quick as other people eat buttered popcorn. These people are not like the volunteer army. These are not like the Vietnam era period. These are not like these people have become more robotic than I think human. And anybody who's counting on them not firing on a patriotic movement, they're just blowing smoke.
I think they've got a name for it. It's called transhumanism. They have been altered here, and they've been programmed here for 50 years. You know, the what we saw in Germany, in my opinion, was genocide, a genocide of the white race. Because I watched some of the videos about the German soldiers. It was like looking at you know, my high school reunion there.
Yeah, I get you. I know what you're saying. I come from the German areas of America myself. I know what you're saying. These people being slaughtered, being shot in the head point blank as they bend on the ground, and I've seen images of that, being massacred. Yeah, they look like kids that I grew up with, put up hay with. And by the way, yeah, I did my first 5 years of my life was spent on one of the farms you're describing right now. I'll tell you what, if life gets any better than that, I don't know it, because I was raised by my grandma, and it was down in Missouri on her farm. Didn't have any money, but man, they had an animal. Every animal in the, you know, chickens, guineas, geese, ducks, turkeys, cows, pigs, goats.
Best food I ever had. Best food I ever had was made by my grandmother after she wrung that chicken's neck.
My grandma sold her eggs at the MFA, and she got enough money to buy groceries, come back and grow some more eggs for next week. But it was, you know, and we don't have any farms anymore. The farms we've got are, they plow a little land and throw out some wheat or corn or whatever. Monsanto, he's deeply involved in that. But no, this is just. However, I'm getting off my train of thought here. Hey, give me a break here for a second. I need to go get a glass of water.
All right, go right ahead.
Be right back.
Go right ahead. I will. Michael's book is, or his website is up on my website, freeamerican.com. You can share this show. People need to know. You know, I believe our time is coming. I believe I could be the watchman on the wall. He keeps throwing these dates out here, and all those dates are right around when I was born, you know, conceived in that time era. And I promise you, folks, I will never give up. I'm going to, and I'm not looking for violent revolution. That belongs to the Jews. That's what they do. They want to stir up the Russians. They want to set the Russians against the white Christians. I don't want to do that. I want to give you some answers. I want to let you know this is a Jewish plot. This was a Jewish, the Bolsheviks were Jewish. And they killed the Russians. They raped and they urged the soldiers, whatever they were, to rape the women, rob and steal. We got to change that. We got to, and I really think we have. I urge you to look at Michael Finley, Michael Finley did a video. I put it up on my Facebook, Free American 69. He's lives in L.A., South L.A. He said South L.A., you know, has fast food. It has, you know, vacant lots. And he started turning these vacant lots into gardens. I think it's a good way to go. He's got a little group there that's growing food. He says growing your own food is like printing your own money.
That's pretty good.
It's a peaceful option. You know, the Jewish revolution that they start, Syria, you know, all over, that's setting up a group, funding them so they can go out and kill people. That's not the kind of revolution that we need. We need a peaceful revolution, and it doesn't have to be authentic. I've told people over and over again, Michael, I don't care who your grandmother slept with. I care about what you want to do for this country and for your neighbor here. Don't care what color you are, don't care what religion you are necessarily, if you're not trying to harm others. If you're working together. And
Yeah,
I happen to be white, so I want to live among white people. It's I don't like rap music. Sorry, guys. No offense or anything, but you know, I want to live among Germans. I want to live among Swedish people. You know, I don't. That doesn't make me a white supremacist. You know, makes me intelligent. That's all the propaganda. Go ahead. What?
I'd like to say I grew up liberal, but I didn't. I really grew up stupid. I can't blame anything on being. I grew up stupid, and I grew up with this egalitarian notion. My mom probably had a pretty good influence on me, and she had lots of black friends, and she helped integrate restaurants in Kansas. And so I absorbed some of that by osmosis, I suppose. And so I had no racial bone in my body, so to speak. In fact, early on, when I was in the military, I had lots of black friends. In fact, one of my best friends was a Jew. In fact, he may have been my best friend. We just had a riot together. But you know, as you grow, and as you get older, and as you encounter more experiences, and if you mature at all, you quit running from certain things and you start accepting certain truths. And it finally occurred to me that, hey, I'm the only one trying in this. In other words, trying to be equal, trying to be non-racist. I've never seen more racism in my life than among blacks in the military. I never saw it. And of course, it was my first big plunge into the world of racial reality. Believe me, there was nothing. We're talking the 60s, of course, as you know very well. And so to see that everybody wasn't like my mom's friends or like some of the ones I knew growing up, that basically, and well, what I'm getting at is that I've just quit trying. I quit trying. I'll be damned if I'm going to keep trying to say that, hey, race doesn't exist. You look like a white person to me, to every black that comes along. When they're not trying. When they're not trying at all. In fact, they're doing the opposite. They're basically encouraging others to hate me. And I'm through with that. I'm sorry. I didn't grow up, I wasn't born a racist, and I didn't grow up a racist, but I damn sure am one now. And it's like yourself. It doesn't mean I hate anybody. It means I prefer living among my own kind. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder. I'm tired of worrying about offending somebody. Totally down for basically being myself. And if the only way I can be myself is to be among my own people, then that's what I'll be, among my own people.
Yeah, I don't want to worry about drive-bys, you know. Actually,
no, and,
I don't want to worry about drive-ins either. As Ron Finley said, drive-ins kill more people than the drive-bys.
Hmm. That doesn't mean my people are perfect. Far from it. In fact, I'm always more disgusted at a rape or a murder committed by a white person than I am about one committed by other races. I am more disgusted, and I feel more like pulling the switch on somebody, because when they do that, it's basically bad for me. It makes me look worse. And I know what that sounds like, but that's just exactly the way I feel. I almost feel like the punishment should be worse for a white person. They should know better. Some of these people that were living in trees 100 years ago, what can be expected from them except to be acting like animals? Whereas our people, we have tens of thousands of years of culture behind us. And to go out and rape a woman, no, I believe that man should probably be hung up by his privates within about a week after he's been convicted of the rape, and then slowly burned to death. I know how savage that may sound, but I wrote a book once, the only true crime book I ever wrote. It was about it's called Toledo Blade, the abduction, rape, and murder of a cop's daughter. And it occurred just up the road from where I live right now. And this was a young 21-year-old mother and housewife. And I don't have to tell you or anybody listening right now that most young white women seem to be totally absorbed in themselves right now. They're into spring breaks, they're into partying, they're into drinking, they're into drugs, they're into tattoos, they're into to numerous other narcissistic events. This wasn't that woman. This woman was all about her family. She dreamed of being a mother, dreamed of being a housewife, was happiest being both. And yet, one day, when she was giving her oldest child his first haircut, a monster, a 39-year-old white monster, 36-year-old monster, came through the door, and that's where it all ended. I don't know what happened there, because the only people there were the little kids and the monster himself, because he took her back to his home after she made sure her children were in their crib and the door was locked. He put her in the back seat of his car, took her 3 miles away to his home, spent the next 40 minutes raping her 3 times, vaginally, anally, and orally, and put her back in the car in the trunk, in the back seat, and drove around the city, Northport, for the next several hours with her screaming in the back seat. She actually managed to get his cell phone away and actually dialed 911. And other people actually dialed 911 that heard her screaming. But nothing worked out. It was a perfect storm of mistakes. He, about 6 or 7 that evening, drove her to an edge of town, made her get on the ground, kneel, shot her in the head, actually in the eye, blew her brains out, buried her like a piece of garbage. And then probably no more than a minute or two afterwards, he was captured as he tried to escape on the interstate by the cops. And that wasn't a black, it wasn't a Jew, it was a white man. That makes me more outraged, honest to God. And, I, as a writer, maybe some people don't understand, but you live your characters. You actually become a part of them. Just like Hellstorm, the book about Germany. Or this I'm talking about now, this true crime. You read it, and you research it, and you write it, and you suddenly start becoming it. And it's like, as you mentioned to open the show, about the emotional aspect. Yeah, I still hear the screams of the women being raped and butchered, their breasts being ripped off by these monsters. And I hear the people screaming as they're running through the streets on fire, because the firestorm has caught them. And I see the Germans drinking their own urine, because Eisenhower in his death camps for German POWs refuses to give them water or food. I see them drinking their own urine. And then I see the Germans being tortured in these Jewish torture colonies in Poland after the war, forced to eat their own excrement, being beaten to death with whips and chairs, and being forced to dig up bodies old, rotting, decayed bodies, the women, and forced to make love to them and kiss them. I go through that crap every night, and I also go through the things like we're talking about now. This young woman, minding her own business, raped, abducted, murdered by this monster, and it's a little bit like you said, Clay, about mostly it's live and let live, and the key word in there is live. When somebody takes it upon themselves to create havoc in the world and death and destruction, I'm against them people. And it just so happens right now we're talking about Jews and blacks, but I'm against all people who commit these crimes. And it makes me sicker and more ashamed when it's my own people, my own race, the white race. And so we have got a lot of housekeeping to do among ourselves. And it's like the enemy without and the enemy within. I don't know where to begin. Right now we're talking mostly about the enemy without.
Well, I might add that Eisenhower, the atrocities that you're bringing up, you'd have to go back to his West Point directory, wouldn't you, to understand?
I've read them.
How did West Point refer to him?
The Swedish Jew, the terrible Swedish Jew.
Terrible.
I don't know. Speaking on Eisenhower right now, that was one of the other components of the book that was just devastating to me. As I mentioned, I'm from Kansas. I grew up a Kansan. I grew up loving Eisenhower. That's where he's from. It's the only president we've ever had. And, I grew up liking Ike. And to find out that he is one of the most cold-blooded mass murderers in world history, that was a double blow to me. And let me say what I mean by that. Eisenhower was an inveterate hatred of Germans. He, time and time again, in letters to his wife and to some others, talked about his hatred of Germans. He said, "God, I hate the Germans. They're beasts." I mean, he wanted to kill. He was one of those who wanted to kill 100,000 German officers and leaders after the war, kill them in cold blood. So Eisenhower was also a desk general, a commissar general, if you will. He had never heard a bullet fired in anger. And he's the child, love child, you might say, of FDR and the Jewish advisors, because they know he'll accept and take the orders they give him without question, because he's an inveterate German hater. So at the end of the war, when millions of Germans finally surrendered, it was a kick in the butt to Eisenhower, because he wanted to kill them all. And now the war is over. So he's got, under his control alone, he had 5 million German, helpless, disarmed German POWs. And he's obliged under the Geneva Convention not to kill them if they are POWs. So what does Eisenhower do? He basically, with a sleight of hand, a little legerdemain, and basically changes the nomenclature. Basically, from POWs, prisoners of war, he transfers them into a new category he created himself out of magic. Basically, DEFs, disarmed enemy forces. Suddenly, they're no longer under the umbrella of the Geneva Convention or the International Red Cross. Suddenly, Eisenhower, this mass murderer, can do whatever he wants with them. And what he did, of course, is kill anywhere from 800,000 to 1.5 million helpless, disarmed German soldiers after the war. After the war, he allowed them to die of starvation, even though the American supply depots were bursting at the seams with plenty of food. Even though the International Red Cross begged to bring train loads of food in for these men who were dying of starvation, he refused them. He let them die of dehydration, lack of water, when rivers were running right beyond the barbed wire. He allowed them to die from lack of medicine. They lived in holes. They dug holes in the earth. People defecated and urinated on the ground that they were forced to lay in. They died, of course, from terrible sickness. And those who could not get out of their holes in time were bulldozed over as they wanted to keep some of the land flat or move to another area. That's Eisenhower. That's the man we elected president after the war. That's I Like Ike. That's the guy that's on the 50-cent piece. One of the greatest mass murderers in world history, Dwight David Eisenhower. And that's just, like I said, the book is full of just such war crimes and war criminals. Let me, also, it isn't just about the, hell, I could go on for another 6 hours talking about this. But for instance, I want to just throw something out right now to you and the listeners. The Lusitania, the American ship that was sunk that actually brought America into World War I. I'm not going to get into why it was sank. I think some of your folks know. But anyway, I think 1,200 people were supposed to have drowned in that sinking. The Titanic, probably the most notable, the most famous of all nautical disasters. The Titanic, when it sank after hitting the iceberg, and 1,500 people died that terrible night. These are terrible events. There's terrible nautical disasters. And that's mostly all we know about it. Has anyone ever heard of the Wilhelm Gustloff? And I doubt if 1 in 100 have heard about it. The Wilhelm Gustloff was an old German passenger liner that was brought into service at the end of the war to help fleeing refugees escape the Red Army, the Soviet Army, escape from Eastern Germany on the Baltic Sea to Western Germany, taking men, women, children, but mostly women, children, and old people from the east to the west. The Wilhelm Gustloff was deliberately sunk one night as it was trying to reach Western Germany by a Soviet submarine. Want to take a guess how many people died in that sinking?
How many?
Anywhere from 8,000 to 9,000. 8 to 9,000. Wrap your head around that. That was deliberate. There was no question about it. No question about it. Those people who didn't drown, of course, this was in February, and the water was full of ice on the Baltic. People hit the water, and within seconds they were dead. Those who tried to, it's a terrible description. But anyway, that's the Wilhelm Gustloff. And again, I allow the people, the few survivors there were, to describe what it was like that night. But unfortunately, it wasn't just the Wilhelm Gustloff. It was one ship after another. The Cap Arcona went down with 4,000 women and children. The other boats went down with 7,000, sunk deliberately, or bombed, as in the case of one ship that tied up, a refugee ship, and the Americans bombed it from a bomber. One landed right in the smokestacks. It went down in its slip. 2,000 people died in that one. It was a massacre on the Baltic Sea as people, refugees, tried to escape the Russians that are sunk by submarines, American bombers, killing. And we're not talking naval vessels. We're not talking about German military vessels with guns and stuff. The Soviets know that they're not. The Americans in the air know they're not. They can see it by the cut of the ship. In the periscope, you can see, hey, this is not a naval vessel. It's chugging along at 10 knots. German vessels chug along at 20 and 25. This is another massacre, similar to the air massacre, the air terror, the terror campaign. And these are war crimes of an extreme, egregious nature. And yet, I haven't even talked about the torture at the end of the war. The torture in the American area, the torture especially in the Soviet area where the Jews took over, their torture colonies, where they, the crimes committed in these things. Everyone's heard of the Nuremberg Trials. Everyone's heard about that. I think a movie was even made of it. This is pure propaganda. What is not said is that there were lots of little Nurembergs going on to try Germans for anything. It didn't matter. War crimes sounds convenient. Let's hang our hat on that, and let's convict them of something. In one, I think it was perhaps in Hanover, a war crime trial going on there. Of the 300 accused, I think something like 295 showed up for trial with their testicles smashed. In other words, they had been tortured. Anything they said in that trial would have been in any free country would have been called a mistrial because it was evidence given under torture. In other words, in fact, that's what that's what the war crimes trials after the war was all about. And it's even mentioned in it. A lot of the people, in fact, most of the interrogators were Jews. There were 39ers who had fled Germany in 1939, fled Nazi persecution, had fled to Canada, America. Now they came back with a vengeance, as they're doing in the Middle East right now, following the American soldiers into these various countries, Baghdad, and other areas, to basically loot, plunder, carpetbag, kill, torture, whatever they want to do. And that's what they did in Germany. And that's the ones who speak good German, understand the culture, who are interrogating these people, many of who had no idea what they were talking about. But nevertheless, when you had a few slivers of wood pounded underneath your fingernails, when you've had your testicles smashed, when you've been beaten black and blue, when you've had hoods put over your head full of blood, and that's what's going to happen to you if you don't, and you're beaten, you will say virtually anything that interrogator, that inquisitor wants to hear. And they did. They confessed. They confessed to everything. Yes, there were death camps. Yes, there was German Nazi atrocities. Yes, they were, doing all sorts of experiments. Yeah, hell, you'll basically swear that your mother and father were the devil. And so, after the war, yes, it was torture run amok. Again, in the words of the people themselves. In fact, high and low. Most people had no idea what the hell was going on. Even so-called hardcore, deadly Nazis, they had no idea what are you talking about? A deliberate policy to kill all Jews? I've never heard of it. But yes, if you will quit beating my testicles to a flattened smash, if you will quit driving things into my anus, if you will quit pulling my skin apart, if you'll quit beating me up, yeah, I'll testify that, yeah, we were killing Jews by the millions. Anything to stop this.
Now, you said they also tortured women.
Oh, yeah. Are you kidding? In fact, nobody was spared. The only people that were seemingly spared were children. And even they weren't spared, of course. They were raped and killed. But I'm talking about to extort, to get some information or to force them to say something. Again, children, they were beyond the pale because, what could a child offer? But yes, women, there's some things that were done to women that I won't mention right now because it's just too terrible to talk about. And honestly, there are passages in the book that I have never gone back to after I finally finished them because they're like I said, they're scripted in hell. Only I'll be honest, Clay, and I'll say this, and I may not win your favor by saying it, but I'm a non-believer. I don't believe in God. I don't believe in devil. But I'll tell you what. After reading this book, I got to believe that maybe there's something to that devil business, because I don't know of anybody who could ever do or even contemplate such bestiality, such torture. Animals certainly not. Some of the things that occurred in this book, and I think that's why, I've pretty much escaped. I'm starting to get quite a bit of it now that the Hasbro trolls are trying to kill the book, trying to kill me, the messenger. It was very hard. I think it's very hard to argue about a book or against a book when it's the people themselves doing the talking. Now, if I had written a book, a narrative, and it was me doing the talking, I think it's an easier book to kill because, you kill the messenger, you pretty much kill the message. But when the book is in much of the words of the people themselves, those who are dying, those who are being tortured, or those who are torturing, or those who are doing the killing, it's pretty hard to dismiss those words in the words of the people themselves. And so I have, for the most part, escaped terrible, terrible killing reviews because I think they realized that it would simply draw more attention to the book itself. You mentioned earlier to begin this conversation that about the film. The film, yes. The film is was done by Kyle Hunt. It's a book or a film based on the book and by the same name, Hellstorm. It was a passionate film. It was seen by 500,000 people or more, probably many, many more. But now it's not. It's not even on YouTube. It's been taken off finally. It's a very well done movie. I think it's very descriptive and it's very true to the book. Actually, if you can get a copy of the film, which is an hour and a half, I believe, you'll get a real good digest, a real good compact idea of what the book itself is about. But like the filmmaker himself said, Kyle Hunt, there's no way you can get the detail, no way you can understand or get true feel for the book from the movie. So it's either, but the point is, the film was removed, whereas you can find some of the most filthy things on earth on YouTube. You're not going to find Hellstorm anymore.
All right, we're almost out of time here. Want to tell you, under your name, if you go to my site, freeamerican.com, click on your name, you can get this show. I think the whole show will be on Blog Talk. I'll also have on YouTube, Free American 69. I'll have this show in 2 halves because we got disconnected. Homeland Security gets upset with me when I start getting into details they don't like. And I got to tell you, I really appreciate you coming on my show. I really enjoyed the conversation. Not the subject material, but you've done a superb job at telling the story, and I think everybody should know it.
Well, Clay, let me say just thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about it. Without the soapbox, the word doesn't get out there. So all honor to you, sir, and thank you so much for everything you're doing. And I've enjoyed it myself. Thanks a lot, Clay.
All right. Thank you, sir. Goodbye.